Okay, let's go. Welcome, everyone. The Climate Outreach and the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations, or CAST, welcomes you to our expert panel on communicating climate target setbacks. So many institutions have set ambitious carbon reduction targets to address climate change. However, as they struggle to meet these goals within their original timelines, they face a significant communications challenge. How can these organisations maintain their credibility with the public while pressing reset on their climate ambitions? So today you'll hear from our 4 expert speakers, each bringing their expertise and nuanced understanding of the challenge before we'll open up to the Q&A at the second half of today's webinar. So please feel free to use the Q&A function and submit your questions when you're ready, and we'll talk to those at the end of the session. So we'll first hear from Professor Lorraine Whitmarsh, and Lorraine will set the scene for us today, where we're seeing targets being missed and the communications challenges that will emerge. Lorraine is the director for CAST, and she's also an environmental psychologist specialising in perceptions and behaviour in relation to climate change. Then we'll meet Dr. Christopher Jones, Knowledge Exchange Fellow at Tyndall, Manchester. Chris's research focuses on accelerating social change and reaching zero emissions. We'll hear from Chris on how organisations can retain the integrity and the intention they set in their original goals when responding to missed targets. Next, James Murray, Editor-in-Chief at Business Green and one of the UK's leading commentators on low-carbon economy, will share his insights on what missed climate targets mean for business and how they respond. And finally, Dave Powell, Senior Advocacy Manager at Climate Outreach, will take us through the communications principles organisations can consider when going public about their missed carbon reduction targets. And Dave closely works with MPs, businesses and governments, championing public engagement and effective climate communications with policymakers and politicians and those who influence them. So without further ado, let me now hand you over to Lorraine, who will kick us off with our panel.
Thank you very much, Tara. And good afternoon, everybody. Lovely to be with you. So cast your mind back to late 2018, the IPCC's 1.5 degree report had just been published, in which we were told that we had just over a decade to save the world, that the reality of climate change was worse than a lot of people thought up until that point, and that we had to really radically accelerate emission reductions if we were to avoid a climate catastrophe. This wake-up call helped to trigger a wave of climate action by the public, including school strikes, XR protests, but also action by organisations, including businesses and local authorities, many of whom declared a climate emergency. Now, CAST research, led by Claire Houlihan, showed that many of those organisations didn't actually follow up with practical action plans to deliver net zero, or they limited the scope of their action in various ways, for example, to scope 1 and 2. And so declaring a climate emergency for at least some was rhetorical more than pragmatic. But for those organisations who did implement serious mitigation objectives and plans, many are now struggling to achieve those very well-intentioned targets. For example, Copenhagen municipality had to roll back from their incredibly ambitious target to be carbon neutral by 2025 a couple of years ago. And many businesses are also rolling back on their commitments. BP has done this several times. In 2020, they set a target of 40% reductions by 2030. Last year, that was reduced to 25%, and most recently, they've abandoned targets altogether. And they're just the latest business to roll back on their environmental commitments. Many organisations citing economic pressures as one of the main factors. But a parallel realization is occurring at the international level, with a lot of scientists now saying that 1.5 degrees or even 2 degrees are no longer achievable, and that we need to rethink global emissions targets. Now, the 1.5 degree and 2 degree targets are enshrined in the Paris Agreement, which is the global UN commitment. And so legally changing that would mean a fundamental overhaul, I think, to the UN climate governance architecture. But at the same time as that's being debated, a lot of governments, of course, we know are already failing to meet their own carbon targets, and lots of climate change committee reports in the UK have shown that the UK isn't on track. And the United Nations emissions gap report, every year they publish a report in the lead up to COP, and this year's report, which was entitled "No More Hot Air, Please," maintains that it is technically just about still possible to keep global temperatures to 1.5 degrees, but only if emissions are cut by 57% in the next 10 years, which would require massively upscaling efforts across all sections of society, including whole of government approach, measures that maximize socioeconomic and environmental co-benefits, reform of global financial architecture, strong private sector action, and no less than a 6-fold increase in mitigation investment. And at the moment, we're looking at global warming of more like at least 3 degrees than 1.5 degrees, unless those things are put in place. But why have we got to this position? So why have national and organisational aspirations not been met? And we'll hear lots from the rest of the panel about this, and I'm sure unforeseen economic and political change has played a role. But I think in part it is also because many of the early wins to reduce emissions hinged on changing energy supply, switching from fossil fuels to renewable energy, which really were technological solutions. The much harder part of decarbonisation, and where we've made very little progress, is still on the demand side. And if you look at the latest government announcements, including Keir Starmer's speech at COP recently, there's still a real squeamishness about the idea that people will have to change their behaviour, that people will do anything at all as part of this tackling climate change. This is despite Climate Change Committee reports showing that about 2/3 of the emissions needed to get to net zero in the UK will require consumer behaviour change, and the remainder will involve business changing. So that will include things like Scope 3 emissions, which I'm sure we'll hear more about. So I think part of the lack of sufficient progress has been really down to a sort of techno-optimist mentality and really sticking within a kind of business as usual framework. And that's underpinned a lot of what organisations and governments have been doing on climate action, and they haven't really yet embraced the challenge or the opportunity. I would like to say I'd see it as an opportunity to use people power to accelerate climate action. So what can we do? Do we make new targets? Do we create new indicators of progress? Maybe we reframe failure as success by a different measure, or perhaps we move away from targets altogether. At the international level, I know that some scientists are saying that temperature isn't a useful climate change progress indicator anyway. It's more an indicator, a symptom really, than actually what we should be tracking, which is emissions concentrations in the atmosphere, so parts per million of greenhouse gases. Or Scottish Government, for example, realising they couldn't reach their near-term carbon targets, have said they're going to move away from single-year targets to rolling 5-year carbon budgets to measure progress. So these are different sorts of responses in terms of kind of thinking about indicators and targets. But I think if we do go down that sort of route, I do think it's important to test those measures in terms of what it means to the public. So for example, I think parts per million is going to be something people are probably going to struggle with in terms of understanding that. Temperature is something more intuitive. So I think it's going to be difficult to move away from a temperature indicator. But I think a more important question anyway is actually, do we use this as an opportunity to respond differently to the problem? Now, some scientists are saying, yes, we should move away from conventional mitigation to actually just moving more wholeheartedly towards adaptation. So Gillian Annable, for example, professor at Leeds, said, it's time to ditch the hope, the endless idea that there'll be a happy ever after destination at the end of the carbon pathway rainbow. That's serving to squash the truth and reality of the state we're in. We now need to lead with a discussion of serious adaptation, with mitigation then likely to accelerate as a result of leaning into our reality. So she says lead with adaptation now. On the other hand, Sir David King has said the lack of progress means we ought to be prioritising radical carbon removals and geoengineering solutions, so actually diverting investment towards things like refreezing the Arctic, spraying chemicals into the atmosphere to clean the air, and so on. A lot of things which are not yet tested. Now, I don't agree with those approaches, actually. I think abandoning known mitigation approaches not only risks exacerbating climate risk because we delay action in favour of unproven technologies, but importantly also means that we miss these vital co-benefits that come with a lot of the mitigation solutions that we're very familiar with. So things like reducing car use and insulating homes, we know how to do that. We could implement those things quite quickly. They'd cut emissions, but they would also improve air quality in cities, reduce congestion, address fuel poverty, and so on. So those co-benefits are critical, and we know that those come along with those mitigation solutions. So for me, I think this is an opportunity to reframe where we are and how we move forward, away from being an engineering challenge that boffins can solve. Some people over there, we can just leave them to it, towards something that actually involves a collective effort that actually everybody in society needs to be a part of, that we all need to play a role, and that this is about improving society in ways that are important to us. And I think, incidentally, that's what Copenhagen have done. So there's an example where they did have a very ambitious 2025 target. They realized they couldn't achieve it through the technological approaches they were relying on, like CCS. They're now going for a target of 50% reduction in consumption emissions by 2035. So a different indicator, different time frame. And they're shifting the discourse towards saying this is about social change. This is about implementing ready-made solutions that we have, and it's about achieving wider benefits to improving people's well-being. And there is a huge evidence base on how we can do that, reframing and that engagement with people. CAST produced a report earlier this year that outlined a lot of that and showed that the public want that there is a public mandate for that more ambitious change, that they want to play a role, and they want upstream measures that enable them to play that more active role, to remove the barriers to action. And I think we'll hear more about all of those sorts of things from Dave. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Lorraine. Now, while Chris just gets his slides set up, just want to welcome everyone to please make use of the Q&A function. So if you have a question right now for Lorraine, stick it in, but we'll hear from all the four speakers first, and then go straight to Q&A, and you have an opportunity to upvote those questions that you really want to get answered. Okay, looks like Chris is ready. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Tara. Yeah, so I'm Chris Jones, and I work at the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research, and all the work is also overlaps with work that we do through the CAST Centre as well. And it's from that background of working with several local authorities in setting climate change targets, and then subsequently on plans to try and meet those targets. I'm going to just give a few reflections on that, primarily around some of the potential pitfalls in that kind of reflection phase, on what to do next, because as Lorraine's very nicely set up there, we're not making the kind of progress that we would have liked and we would have anticipated, but that is where we are, and this happens a lot in a lot of other settings as well, and the response to that is really more important than reflecting on the failure necessarily. So we're going to sort of reflect on that a little bit. So most a number of local authorities will probably have some sort of graph like this in an annual report if they report their emissions annually, and it'll probably have a target line like we have dashed here in orange, and increasingly there's a divergence there between the sort of what was set in an action plan and what was set in a target maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and where the historic emissions trend has gone. And that reflects that many local authorities and other organizations set very ambitious targets around 1.5 temperature goal, and also wanted to be quite rightly leading and to accept some sort of understanding of where local authorities, places like the UK, and where organizations operating in developed countries are in terms of their historic emissions and their contribution to future reduction rates. So usually organizations end up with quite an ambitious reduction rate, often in the realms of 10% per annum, or a very near term date like 2025 we heard with Copenhagen, or 2030 net zero. We know there are a lot of organizations set. However, as has been mentioned, progress against those targets has been very difficult, particularly as we've gone from a period of rapid improvement in the national grid in the UK. If you're a UK organization, you probably will have quite happily seen emissions reducing quite quickly between 2013 and 2018 in particular, when coal was phased out of the grid. But since then, really, it's come down to what we do at the local level. If you're a city, and what you do through your procurement practices and your own energy use if you're an organization, particularly transport, heating. And those are not things that happen far away on the other end of the electricity cable. They're things to do with how we travel around cities, how we heat homes, as Lorraine mentioned. And it's those changes where things have been fairly flat. In fact, if we looked at this per source of emission, that historic target, we might have seen electricity come down, but transport and heating been largely flat over the last 10 years. Maybe some slight improvement in some areas, but nothing near that 5 to 10% reduction rate that we were talking about for the 1.5 goal. And this is not an issue unique to local authorities. In fact, authorities and organizations that set ambitious and equity frame targets for 1.5 are almost like the canary in the coal mine, in the fact that because they were going earlier on these targets, they've come to miss those targets sooner than the global average. And we're a long way off that global average. So this is not exclusively a UK local authority or a UK organizational issue. It's a pattern we could give in pretty much any context around the world, sadly, and it puts us in an increasingly challenging position for where we go forward. And we, as Leah mentioned again, we start grasping for some solutions that are more in the realm of science fiction than what we know how to do in practice. So as I mentioned at the start, really how we respond to this kind of gulf between targets and performance is really important. Because while we very unlikely to keep to this 1.5 target, and we know that that's going to bring with it various pressures on the environment, we know that exceeding 2 and going beyond that to 3 are increasingly more difficult to live with, and increasingly more damaging. So we do need an appropriate response to this gulf between targets and performance that is as positive and ambitious as we can be. And there are a couple of points that kind of come from largely discussions that I've had with organizations over the last couple of years around this issue. And it's kind of like a list of things to maybe reflect on that we might try to avoid when reflecting on this, and then on the flip side, things we might want to do. Obviously, the worst case scenario probably would be to abandon the idea of having any sort of target or ambition or way to measure or rally action altogether. And while it might be the case that we don't emulate the previous target setting approach that we had before, we can't have a situation where we essentially drift without any particular guide on how we determine whether what we're doing is enough. We need some sort of framing for our level of action, and ideally that would be a target setting approach that elevates our level of action and accelerates it. And the second kind of related point is, even if we're not dropping targets altogether, we can definitely we all potentially have this habit of taking a long time to consider a new target. We don't have years to consider a new target or a new framework, really. We can't lose any more time. So almost as bad as dropping a target altogether is going into a process that takes years to set a target and set a framework for action. So really we have to be decisive in this period as well. And luckily we know that what we set out to do in the past is what we still need to do now. So in many ways we can accelerate action without waiting for any further change in that framing. And the third point, which is very specific to carbon emissions, is essentially to reach for carbon accountancy tools to try and take the edge off the difficulties we have with mitigation. And carbon removals were mentioned there, which there could be a thing in the future for some sectors, but I think we increasingly get into trouble where we start looking at the idea of can we buy carbon offset credits to address our underperformance in mitigation, and that's incredibly problematic for a lot of reasons. I think if you just take a Google of carbon offset scandal, you'll find several examples of where the voluntary market is not really in a position to really deliver anything consistently meaningful as an alternative to mitigation. And while carbon removals as a more as a safer alternative to the old traditional carbon credits, they're very limited already, and really we need them for a lot of other sectors. We can't be using them for things like housing or transport around the surface of the UK. We need them for other things, and we don't have enough of them anyway. So I think we really have to be careful with taking any sort of response that is an alternative to mitigation. I would say really there is no alternative to mitigation. And by mitigation, I mean driving down our emissions and getting fossil fuels out of our energy system and our food system, greenhouse gases out of our food system. So yeah, I think that's quite an important practical word of caution. And then I think fourthly, really we need to take a bit of time to reflect on why we haven't performed against targets. I feel like if we were doing this in any other setting as well, we'd probably reflect on how can we do better in the future. Probably requires us to understand why things didn't go well in the past and avoiding repeating similar mistakes. And I think that needs a very honest discussion around things like finance, governance, social acceptability, engaging with the public and businesses and supply chains, and there's needs to be quite an honest discussion there. But really that's essential, or we risk sort of just letting things drift on without switching to that more impactful and meaningful response. And then finally, I think we have to accept that by not achieving the level of performance that we know we needed to avoid dangerous levels of climate change, we are going to experience dangerous levels of climate change. Now, hopefully that won't go much beyond 1.5, but I think it's increasingly safe to say that it's prudent to be adjusted for the kinds of impacts we might see at 1.5 and beyond, because they are very, very, very likely to happen. And while we've talked a lot about how mitigation can be expensive and difficult financially and in terms of social acceptability, adaptation and dealing with climate risk are certainly orders of magnitude more expensive, and potentially also how you measure it also more disruptive to society as well. So by reflecting on that process of why we're behind the target, we also have to reflect on the implications of being behind that target, and in many cases those are living with quite extreme environmental change even within the next 5 to 10 years. Yeah, just quickly do flash up there. As well as setting the targets, we've also got a core benefits decision support tool to help organizations to try and get on track with climate targets. It's a small toolkit to help align some governance choices around that. But if you are interested in yeah, those kind of next steps, then I would advise to have a look at that as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chris. It's really fascinating. And now we're going to get the business perspective. James, shall I hand over to you?
Excellent. Thanks, Tara. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Yeah, so this is sort of business perspective, also a bit of a sort of journalistic perspective, really, of someone who's kind of reporting on the other side of these announcements when they get made of people missing targets. There's just a few very quick points I'd make. I mean, the first one is this is definitely going to be a growing problem, as I think everyone's touched upon. You had a lot of companies setting targets, just using round numbers or sort of the natural points at which you'd expect to set a target of like 2025 or 2030, and obviously those dates are coming up in 2025's case very soon, and in 2030 if you've got a long-term target you can sort of see the trajectory. So we are starting to see reappraisals coming through, companies missing targets, also crucial to note companies hitting targets as well. I mean, there's a lot of companies that are really actually surpassing what they expected and doing really well. And I think there's an element of my colleagues in the press like a bad news story, so it gets more focused on the ones that miss than the ones that hit. But it is a choice often to miss these targets. They can be hit in a lot of cases. But in terms of advice of what to do if you are kind of missing the targets, I mean, again, the old joke of I wouldn't start from here definitely applies. A lot of the targets that were set, very well intentioned, were just not thought through nearly enough. They were too ambitious. The idea you could reach net zero by 2030 in any kind of credible or realistic way was, just slightly absurd if you just unpacked it even for a few seconds. So there's definitely a lot of people who are falling victim of well-intentioned ambition, but ambition that was never particularly well thought out and not backed by the levels of investment that were necessary to meet these goals. So that, I think, needs to be recognized when you do sort of appraised what to do if you're sort of missing these goals. In terms of how to respond, there are options here, and they come down a little bit to how cynical you're feeling. Because if you're quite a small organization, believe me, people are probably not going to notice. You can get away with not providing a particularly honest update on how you've missed these targets and hoping it gets missed. I probably shouldn't even be saying this, but there is a cynical playbook here that some companies will definitely take and some councils will definitely take that not many people notice, and if they do, it will blow over. And I think, people will be doing those calculations as to whether they qualify in that thing. However, for lots of businesses, particularly in the public sector, particularly if you're listed and you're increasingly subject to kind of reporting rules on this, or if you're a big brand, there was a story just last week, Coca-Cola got hauled over the coals. We reported on it, the FT reported on it, for them dropping some plastics targets. All the green groups, believe me, they have the spreadsheets with all your previous statements. They will know, and they will make a huge fuss if you try and water it down at all. So at that point, you then have two options. Do you try and kind of underplay it? I'm trying to spin it and say, well, look, these are the targets we missed, and just in a footnote, yeah, we just missed this one by a little bit, which again might work, but there's risk there because then it looks less honest, it looks less engaged, it looks less open when you're sort of admitting, you're tacitly admitting that you missed a target rather than owning it. The best practice here, and the most sort of responsible thing to do if you're really committed to the transition, is to own it. Is to come out and try and say, this is why we missed, this is how much we missed, this is why it's really difficult. And again, that's a tricky engagement, because are you going to say it's really difficult because other people screwed up, our suppliers screwed up, the government screwed up, we weren't provided with the necessary means to get there, which is often legitimate because a lot of these targets are dependent on other people outside your control. But then from a kind of PR perspective, you could then say, well, you're just shifting the blame. But there are ways of doing that. There's ways of explaining it, putting it in that context properly, explaining clearly why you missed a target in a sort of open and honest way, without necessarily taking all the blame yourself, and sort of making clear that this is kind of an economy-wide thing. And if the grid isn't decarbonised, or the heating system isn't decarbonised, or if there isn't enough hydrogen available, or whatever it might be, this becomes a very difficult thing to do. And that I think can work reputationally, and it certainly can work in terms of the political economy of what we're all trying to achieve here, because you are opening up the space for that debate about the wider changes that need to be made. you then also need to explain, and this is the crucial part, is obviously this is, you know, if you're admitting you've missed a target, that's a historic failure. The critical thing is what does come next. So how do you then explain, right, this time, this is what we're doing, and we're going to be doing it in a more credible way? And that's where we're seeing a lot of people fall down. So there's a story just today about Morgan Stanley quitting one of the net zero financial coalitions. And they're saying, well, we are still committed to net zero. But then it's just so opaque. It's like, well, how? If you don't want to do it through this avenue, what's the alternative avenue? And again, there's a really constructive story you can tell there. You can talk about, okay, well, this was proven too difficult, but now we're going to invest more. Or now we've got a strategy to work closer with our suppliers. Or now maybe it is the case of, you know, we feel we need to do more on carbon removal and carbon offsets, and we're going to look at the more credible end of that market to try and do that. So there's no point saying, if you're just saying, oh, I missed the target, or trying to avoid being accused of missing the target, and then don't have a contingency strategy of what needs to improve from there on in, then you are going to get hauled over the coals. You are going to take a reputational hit, and deservedly so. I mean, there's so much more we could unpack here. I won't go on for much longer. I mean, there's two other things to say. One, do you want that really difficult debate about whether the 1.5C goals are really credible or not anymore? And I know there's a fierce debate, and people, you know, all of whom are climate hawks kind of disagree on this as to whether that target is still valid. But if you are going to sort of say, well, no, we're going for a less ambitious target of more like the 2C zone, then you need to sort of explain why. You need to sort of set out that context. And going back to where I started, you don't have to miss the targets. That there are now, it's difficult, but now in virtually every industry there are real leaders and there are the laggards. And a lot of the leaders are showing that with often multi-billion-dollar investments, they often have very deep pockets, but with technologies that exist, you can get to a very, very deep decarbonized business by having a clear plan backed by serious money. And we're reporting on stories like that all the time. I mean, there's this, I mean, just off the top of my head, there was a story recently about Screwfix, which is literally the least glamorous company you can talk about, that basically now has heat pumps in almost all of its facilities UK wide. And they've just quietly got on doing it over a 5-year period, and are now a very, very low carbon business in terms of their facilities and assets. There was a story last week about Panasonic just converting a incredibly unglamorous microwave factory in South Wales that is now going to be running on green hydrogen and solar panels, and it's going to slash its emissions by best part of 80%. So there is a lot of reasons where you can explain why these targets are very, very difficult to meet. But there are, in every industry, there's always a few people who are showing the rest of everyone else up by actually showing how it can be done. And that is obviously what is desperately needed over the next decade and beyond. And at that point, I'll shut up because I think I'm running over slightly. But thank you.
That's wonderful, James. And I'm really fascinating to think about the companies that actually are making it, and a really interesting perspective on those who have yet to miss a target, that there are companies and examples out there doing it well, and with proper investment, you can do it. So, but for those who have crossed that boundary, that have missed it, or are about to, how do we talk about it, Dave?
Right, very good. How do you talk about it? Well, look, a lot of what I'm going to say, I'm Dave from Climate Outreach. It's brilliant to be here. A lot of what I'm going to say has been sort of mentioned in particular by James, but I'm going to take a bit of a step back and look a little bit at kind of what makes for good communication in general and what it can teach us about this. So hopefully you can see my slides. Now, the really, really good news is I'm only going to take about a minute to do this, because there is an off-the-page core script that you can use, a one-size communications playbook. So that's the good news. And the bad news is actually that's not true at all. I've been lying to you, because actually it is more complicated than that. There is no core script. There is no off-the-shelf thing. People hope there is, that you can use. As James said, it entirely depends kind of where you are, what sort of organization you are. It depends who trusts you, what you've done before, and the journey that you have taken people on. But what I want to spend a bit of time talking about is 3 things that they're absolutely essential principles, it seems to me, to navigate you being in a position as an organization or a government or whatever of having set a target and missed it. And these things are essential for great climate communications in general. And those principles are, firstly, be trustworthy. Secondly, talk like a human. And thirdly, give people a bit of belief, give people a reason to keep on believing. And these are things I heard coming out from what James and Lorraine and Chris were saying. And it is just really good comms advice in general. If you're doing this in both your comms about any target that you've missed, but your ongoing communications about setting them, why you set them, who you are as an organization, who you are as a government, why you are doing what you're doing, you're going to be giving yourself a lot better chance of dealing with any problems that might emerge down the line. So just a bit of perspective first of all, and Chris in particular has said this, Lorraine has said this, James has said this, but setting targets is good. Setting ambitious targets is a good thing, whether you're a government or a business. There's all sorts of internal business reasons why targets are useful. JFK didn't set a vague aspiration at some point in the future to go to the moon. There's loads of investment reasons. James has talked about what can be done, but it's also hugely important to set targets for communications purposes. And when you're looking at something like climate or net zero or the environment or all of it, it can seem so massive and looming and depressing, but targets help us, the public, feel that the people we should be doing something are doing something, and that something might just help. And we need that. We need, CAST has done some great work through our colleague Steve Westlake has done some brilliant work on how people do look up to leaders and businesses when they walk the talk. They need them to do it. And everyone is up for doing their own bit. We hear that in our research at Climate Outreach all the time. But more than anything else, they think it is business and government that should step up. So it's important to do that as part of the overall story. And as James said, that broader political economy. So the first principle, to be trustworthy. We've done a lot of work over this year at Climate Outreach about this critical thing of trust. It's a tightrope. Globally, people, including in the UK, people are less and less trusting that governments both want to or will change the big problems around us, more and more cynical about big business. 45%, almost half of the public, this is from last year's British Social Attitudes Survey, almost half the public said they would almost never trust the UK government to place the needs of the nation above party interests. And we could insert any number of stats and facts you'll have seen about this over the last year in the wake of the election. It's pretty distrustful times. And so one of the most important communications reasons why it matters how we talk about setting targets and what we do when we miss them is that if we get this wrong, we're playing into that. We're making that distrust worse, this cynicism and this kind of weariness. And there is a bigger game here. James was quite right to say it. We've done research in the summer this year about what makes for a great trusted communicator. What do we look for? Who do we look for? Who do we trust? And why do we trust them to talk about anything but climate in this case? And we look for an empathetic communicator, a passionate communicator, and more than anything else, a credible communicator. We want to know that people can be trusted, that we can believe them, that they have that they are saying something that is real. As anyone who has dealt with a government's complaint inbox or a company's complaint inbox would know, people are super alert to hypocrisy in climate communications. The idea of saying one thing and doing another, this idea of being unfair or just greenwashing really does get people's backs up. And while it can seem like that sort of misunderstanding what's going on, what people do want to do their bit. But we don't like being made to feel guilty or feeling like we should be doing something if we don't see that governments and businesses are doing it. And this is why trust is so important, why setting yourself a target you can reach. James is absolutely right about that. Attempting to meet it, but being credible and being passionate and empathetic about that really matter. So a few don'ts and do's for being trustworthy. Don't set a target you have no chance of meeting. I'm so pleased James started with this, but it does matter. Don't do it because you won't meet it, but don't do it because people will know you're not going to meet it. People won't buy it. You'll end up having to row back from it. You'll end up undermining that broader trust. And what we critically need in climate communication is people that we trust doing the things that they said they're going to do, or at least being real about it if they can't. But do still set those ambitious targets. If it's a stretch, should be a stretch, target should be a stretch, it should be a doable stretch. Tell people that and tell them if you might fall short, say we might fall short, but it'll be huge progress wherever we get to, and keep communicating about it as you go. Don't spring a missed target on people. You will learn as you get on with stuff, and as you're learning things, talk about it. And as James said, you know, often people won't even be paying attention, but if they are, you're giving yourself a leg up by at least being honest about what's happening and why. We look for some great examples. Every example I'm going to give you here could be picked apart, I'm sure, for various reasons, and that's kind of the point, is that there's no perfect way of communicating about this. But Microsoft changed its targets, Microsoft fell short. But I like this line from the president of Microsoft saying, you know, can I promise we're going to get there by 2030? We're going to keep trying. We're going to keep making more progress. I don't want to give up. We've made a lot of progress. And that's the real story. Will this keep everyone happy? No. Will it stop those attacks from green groups? Probably not. Will it stop the emails coming in? No. But you are at least communicating in a way that keeps it real. Second principle, talk like a human. This is in general a good idea in communication, in climate communication. We're not always great at it in climate and environment world. Which is funny because people are really good at talking like humans because they're humans. When we talk to people in our focus groups and our research and we ask them about climate change, they don't talk about net zero and targets and all that sort of stuff. They talk about the things that move them, things that may not seem like they're climate change in a wonkish kind of way, but they are. People talk about how much they love their local green spaces or how angry the state of those spaces will make them. They talk about sewage, they talk about dead fish washing up in the river, they talk about something feeling odd with the weather, and they'll often say things that's like, I just do care about climate change. Of course, that's what we do. We care about this. They don't have great long reasons for it. People just care because they care. And people in business and government care too. You don't go to work to mess up the planet. And there's this story of kind of people in business and government doing their best because they care that we don't hear enough of, because this stuff matters, because it matters to the things they care about in our daily kind of lives. What is really interesting is I emailed a few organizations in the run-up to this webinar to see if they'd come on and talk. And there were organizations pretty well known for having set targets and missed them. And even in private, those organizations would use super kind of defensive technical language. They'll often double down on it. They'll say, well, you know, we missed this target, but we've set another target, and wrap it up in all this talk that no one really understands kind of what it means. It comes across as really defensive, not very human. And it's not the sort of thing you get in other places. You don't get it in football. Like if a team sets out to win the Premier League and doesn't do it, they don't come out and say, well, we'll try again with a different metric, but actually we were the winners this year. You know, if you look at this data point and that data point, you know, it's not kind of how it works. We could probably learn a thing or two from how footballers and football managers talk about falling short. I love to, you know, if we're talking about falling short, let's talk about Arsenal. It's always a fun thing to do. But you know, this is just an example we could have picked about someone who has a more sort of human-facing, human story to tell. Mikel Arteta here, the manager of Arsenal, talking about, you know, we're certainly going to try it. We're trying to climb the highest mountain. We're surrounded by people trying to do that too. We're going to try. I personally want to keep trying. If I'm not able to do it, I will learn from it. That's the way I am. That kind of personal story about how this matters is really, really important. So for talking like a human, don't gaslight people. Other panelists have mentioned this. If you have missed your target, just say you've missed your target. Don't try and make it sound like you have. People are really, really sensitive to that. They will understand that you are fibbing to them. They'll be disappointed and they'll lose faith in you the next time. Do say why you're setting targets in the first place, why it matters to you as an actual human and the institution that you work for, which is made up of actual humans. These targets are the results of humans trying to do their best, knowing they might fail, but wanting to do it anyway. And talk about that motivation, the why you set the target, because it will protect things that we love, because we all want to do our bit to leave the world a better place, because running a government isn't about making the world a worse place. And then the third point, and I'm nearly finished, is to give people a reason to keep on believing. It can be easy to think we've got no hope. You know, we hear stuff in the news about 1.5 being out of sight, about, you know, as James says, we often hear less about the companies that do well, but we'd certainly hear about the ones that don't and the governments that fail. And so much brilliant stuff is happening, so much progress is being made, and it's never going to be uniformly smooth. There's a brilliant story that I love, just a sort of tangent for a minute, about when America was trying to put man on the moon and get them back again by the end of the 60s. It was all going wrong. It was 1967, 1968. There'd been a test flight disaster. Astronauts had been killed. The Soviets were doing much, much better, and time was running out. It didn't look like America was going to make it. People were losing faith it could be done. They were starting to question the whole point of the public spending. The public mood was turning. And obviously doing this for the public mood was kind of the point of going there in the first place. So despite all the huge pressure to make every single remaining test flight absolutely perfect, and despite the fact the astronauts did not want to do it, in 1968, a test flight, the one that I think preceded the one that actually got to the moon, or maybe the one before that, NASA made astronauts do a live TV broadcast. They made them broadcast back to Earth to excite them again, to show what it was like to see a live broadcast from space. It re-energized the story, it excited, it wowed people all over again. And you know, the rest is history. You have to find, even when things are looking a bit tough, you have to find that way to tell people, actually, you know what, there's still a reason to keep believing here. Flip side of being realistic, of being down to earth about targets being met, is still giving people a reason to shoot for the stars. And the number one reason that will guarantee we don't do enough about climate change is people giving up that we can do enough about climate change. So look, the most important thing our communications has to do about any sort of setback is to make it, I think, seem like, okay, we've had a setback, but it's a blip. It's a recalibration on a broader journey that is otherwise still in the right direction. Here's a great quote from the Shannon Carshand, who runs the Church of England's Net Zero program, you know, just making it clear that 2030 is a target, but it's a point on a longer journey. So we may not have finished it by 2030. There'll still be work to do. That's a narrative that gives you a lot of a leg up if you miss that 2030 target. But this idea of things being a journey, they're not absolute. There's not a line in the sand that we meet it or we don't meet it by 2030, that we're heading in the right direction, but that so much is being done is really important. So look, just some do's for giving people a sense of belief. Do talk about what you're doing next, why this is a journey, why you're still on it. Share what you have learned from your journey so far, what you'll do differently next time, why you're really happy to have learned this. Own the things that you got wrong, but celebrate those things you got right. In the process of meeting a target or not meeting a target, loads of brilliant things will happen. James gave some examples. You know, there's so many great examples of companies doing stuff quietly. Maybe they miss a very, very headline target, but doing brilliant things, and we should share that, and governments could do that as well. And this celebrating the wider progress, that the inspirational change it's having in your organization, the cultural change, the human change, and that you are part of a journey where all around us things are changing. So look, there is no off-the-shelf core script for this. How you navigate setting missing targets is going to depend the target that you set. We at Climate Outreach are really happy to work more with any organization that's thinking about how to communicate the setting of a target, the story about a target, the ongoing narrative, and heaven forfend what happened if you missed it. Get in touch if we can help you. But just remember that the tools you would want to deploy in the event of missing a target are probably good tools to deploy in general in having a trusted climate conversation. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Dave. Really fascinating. Now, I'm just going to share one more screen with you before we jump straight into our 10-minute Q&A. There is a QR code there. Your feedback will be massively appreciated because it'll help us continue to improve how we share our insights with you. And as Dave told you there, yes, we offer research and we advise. So if you've heard some things in this webinar that have started a journey for you and you want to continue going into a bit more detail about how you can approach this most effectively and impactfully, you can come to us at Climate Outreach and at CAST for additional support and advice. And we also run trainings and workshops like you've seen today. But I'm going to go straight back to the panel because I know we've already got a question to respond to, and I won't be able to make this brief, so I'm going to read it out. This is from John. The Scottish Climate Intelligence Service, who support 32 local authorities in Scotland to take coordinated and effective net zero action. Do panelists have any thoughts on the type of resource we could create and engagement strategies we could support our local authority users to implement to help them better communicate their climate journeys? So in your experience, what kind of resources can local authorities find most useful? And what engagement strategies have tended to stick the best in the past? Who would like to respond to that? You want to come in, Dave?
Well, I'll just as John said, I mostly sort of banged on about this. I do think, but you know, that my headline sort of take on this, I think, is keeping it human and values based as much as possible. So great climate communications in general does not start from a target and a science-based target and sort of seeks to explain the science-based target in sciencey terms, important though that is. It starts from the stuff people like, the stuff people value, and obviously that depends who you're talking to, right? It was a sort of theme, I think, through a lot of what I was saying, that talking about the human motivations and the human reasons for doing it. So telling the stories of the people who will benefit, the people who are benefiting, the cultural change, the things that people who work in an institution or a local authority are hearing, it is really important. And I think that's one of the main things you don't tend to get enough of in kind of talking about target setting, is the human hopes and dreams part of it. So I'll shut up because I have mostly talked, but I do think that's a central point, John.
I mean, I could just jump in there on some of the local authority stuff. There's really amazing work going on in a lot of local authorities. I mean, some of the sort of public sector decarbonisation funding that's going on, some of the sort of localized incentives or purchasing schemes for renewables, and because local authorities are obviously so cash strapped at the moment, there isn't much funding that seems to go into communicating that and telling people what's going on. And obviously, sometimes when local authorities do that sort of thing, they get criticised for like spending money on communications, whether it's something as simple as flyers or digital campaigns or whatever it may be. But I think there is real value, as Dave touched on, in telling people the successes that has happened. I mean, how many people in this country know that, you know, best part close to 60% of our power is now clean? And that's happened in the space of less than 10 years. Or it's a remarkable achievement. And there's really exciting things coming up that local authorities are an incredibly good touch point for, like kind of more flexible grids, incentivizing people to use power at different times of the day, the availability of electric vehicle charging, heat pump rollout, all this stuff where there's various grants and incentives and things available, whether it's from government or from companies. And I would guarantee you that if you asked, you know, most men and women on the street, they would have very little awareness that this is happening. So I think it's a place where, you know, it's often hard to make the case for marketing spend and communication spend and coordinated strategies just to talk about how great the things you're doing are. But if we're not doing that, you're not going to build the momentum and you're not going to get the changes that can deliver these really positive outcomes for local businesses and local people. And those positive outcomes, particularly in the current climate, is we will make your energy bills cheaper. We will save you money. We will make your town centre a nicer place to live. These are like really basic positive things that the country desperately needs to hear, and we're just not hearing them, even when they are happening, even in the places where they are actually happening. And I think that, yeah, a sort of more assertive approach and a bit more budget behind it is probably one of the ways to go.
Next question from Victoria. What would you say is the best way to motivate staff? So those internal staff members who are not necessarily engaged on the climate issue, yet are being asked to make changes in their role towards those organizational goals.
I'm not wanting to sound exactly like Dave, but I think it is about kind of understanding your audience and thinking about what's going to motivate them. So it's not okay really to rely on people's kind of intrinsic motivation to do the right thing on climate change. Some people will go the extra mile just because they value the environment. But actually you need to embed those incentives within organizational structures. So it's part of people's jobs to do the right thing. So actually when it comes to annual appraisals and promotions and so on, that actually people are going to be rewarded for doing good things for the climate, for helping achieve environmental goals within the organization, rather than it being a kind of nice to have add-on that only a few people are motivated to do. So I think it's about embedding it. It's about also using kind of opportunities. So thinking about when as well to get people to kind of change their habits. A big part of our work is about kind of moments of change. And so actually when people start at an organization, when they actually join a new employer, that's a critical time to actually give them an induction to say the culture in this organization values climate action. This is what we do, and this is how you do it, and give people really clear insights into how it can be part of their role as well. So induction is important, as well as kind of ongoing training, but making it easy, making it embedded in the role. But I see Dave has more to say.
Oh, just very quickly, I think also involving staff in how to do that. So one of the great engagement principles in general is, if you are wanting to get people to do something, then listen to them, talk to them, find out what they think that means, as much as possible, where there's flexibility in how it looks like. You want it to be something that people in your organization have sort of been involved in coming up with themselves. There'll always be people, like, no one goes to work for any organization because they want to ruin the planet, right? There'll be people who work for any given organization who really care about this stuff, and will see it as something they really want to get involved with. You'll get great ideas. You might find connecting different people with different ideas from all over the organization might come up with something that, you know, nobody would ever have thought of. So I would, yeah, that's a shout out for involving people as well.
And I just add to that as well. I think there's a key point that a lot of senior management gets wrong in a lot of businesses, of explaining the why. Like, why are you doing this? You often sort of get this sort of like the strategy, whether it's climate or anything, like the strategy comes down, the targets come down, and the people on the shop floor, or the people who actually have to do it, are just like, well, why are we doing this? What's the exit strategy? What's the long-term vision? And with so much of these climate strategies, there's not sufficient explanation of the why. So to just take one really pertinent example at the moment of like the electric vehicle and the automotive market transforming. Why are those companies transforming over to electric vehicles? Well, because if they don't, they're screwed. I mean, like, they're done, because China's making electric vehicles that are cheaper, that run better, and we are going to have ever more competition. So even if you took aside the whole we need to decarbonize because of climate change things, these companies have a strategic, long-term necessity to change what they've been doing for the last 100 years, or they are in a world of pain. They are going to be Betamax. Now, you just don't hear the executive board of those companies explaining to the people who are going into work every day and having to change their production lines or do all these things, and are seeing job losses in their industry, why they're having to make these changes. And there's got to be an explanation of, like, we're going through this painful period, or this challenging period, because we want to survive. We've been going for 100 years. We want to go for another 100 years. We want to be at the cutting edge. We want to, sell more cars, make more money, so that we can secure a job and you can make more money. And that narrative within businesses in so many sectors is just never explained. So I think sort of treating people with a bit of respect, basically, to say, well, yes, we're at the top of the business, we've made this strategic decision, but here's why we've done it. If you don't do that, you're always going to get resistance from people who are just like, well, why am I doing this beyond getting a paycheck at the end of every month? And that does not make for a motivated workforce. You want to sort of bake them in to the project and explain what the project is.
Thanks, James. We've got about 30 seconds, so why don't we go with one last question from Hilary, and she's asked us about public concerns about fairness. So there's marked differences in income, differences in energy demand based on income. So how can you be sensitive to that public kickback on how carbon emissions reduction interventions are seen to hit poorer communities and local and national government that's not been able to recognise and address this? Can anyone respond to that in 30 seconds?
Well, just a quick one is, I mean, the higher income households are usually the best to target for carbon emission saving, because they usually have higher energies per person, so we get a bigger saving. But I think there is a case where some of the funding does focus quite rightly on low income households to reduce their emissions, because that seems to be a good way for councils to spend money. I think there does have to be a consideration of how we intervene to push higher income families to implement these measures as well, instead of getting into a habit of targeting interventions exclusively at low income, and making the low income targets less about behavior and more about, like, here is actual funding to change your home to make it better.
Muted, Tara.
Tara, you're on mute.
Apologies. I was thanking you, Lorraine, and Chris, and Dave, and James, for your really fascinating insights today. I think this has really kicked off a really useful and practical journey that many organisations and institutions across the UK will be on. So please do stay in touch if this has started something for you. We're here, and we would like to offer you some more support as you continue your next ambitious journey to getting fossil fuels out of the system. So thank you to the speakers and thank you to all, and have a lovely afternoon.